All right, so good morning, everybody. I'm Mike Albertson, the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Thank you for tuning in this morning to hear Dr. Chris Miller, who is an Assistant Professor of International History at Tufts University, for his CGSR lecture series talk titled Drivers and Limits to Russian Foreign Policy in Asia, From Peter the Great to Putin. Let me try to set the stage, as always, as we do here at CGSR, for Chris's presentation with some introductory remarks of my own. One of the big national security questions US policymakers face right now is that of the dynamics between China and Russia as the US enters into, or at last recognizes, an era of strategic competition with these two countries simultaneously. In just about every book published recently on Russia that you pick up, it's going to point out in big, bold print the strengthening ties between Russia and China and the close relationships between their leaders, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Just to give you one example, I was reading this book by Angela Stent called Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest earlier this week while I was eating lunch. There's a whole chapter on Russia and China. There are talks about how Putin invited Xi to his birthday party, which I bet was a pretty lavish one. Xi Jinping called Vladimir Putin my best, most intimate friend. There's a picture of Putin and Xi making pancakes in Vladivostok, next to a picture of a joint military exercise in the Russian Far East. So you get the close personal relationship, you get the military angle, and it's obviously intended to give you the effect of this is something you should be worried about. This is a trend taking place. So Russia and China is a very hot topic. There are several angles to explore this question, and what we're trying to do here at CGSR for you at the lab is highlight some of those angles and those debates that are taking place out in the broader national security community. So one angle, as I mentioned, is this relationship at the top between Xi and Putin, the personal leadership dynamics that drive Chinese and Russian foreign policy. A lot of work has been done in political science and international relations scholarship on this. You know, how much of their partnership depends on the personal relationship between these two rulers? How will it change when one of them departs from the scene, however sooner in the future that may be? It's a fascinating topic, but it's one we're going to save probably for another day and another speaker. Another angle to look at is the so-called strategic partnership between Russia and China. How real is it? How deep is it? How does this partnership complicate the US's ability to act against either of them alone or the two of them together in concert? How does Chinese nuclear expansion that we've all seen in the press change the largely bipolar strategic dynamic between the US and Russia? Lots of big questions to explore. We brought in Tanvi Madan a few weeks ago to talk about China and the US-India relationship. We brought in Bobo Lo to speak a couple of months ago on the Sino-Russian strategic partnership. Tanvi's talk was excellent. It's well worth going back and watching if you haven't. If you missed Bobo's talk, again, well worth going to the CGSR site and checking it out. You know, his analysis was, this is an alliance. This is a great power relationship driven by common interests, not shared values. He noted Russia and China recognized there were lots to be gained by this relationship, made a comparison to the idea of mutualism in the animal kingdom, and then he went on to list all of the potential benefits of their strategic partnership: political comfort, enhanced sense of security, military and technological expertise, geopolitical benefits, economic gains. So that was another great talk. And a third angle, I think, is what we'll get into a little bit more today with Chris. It's this idea that we think of Russia primarily as a regional European actor, and then we think of China as a regional Indo-Pacific actor. China is increasingly a factor in European deterrence and defense discussions, as well as debates about European economic relationships with China as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a very vibrant debate at NATO right now on China, and you can see that starting to emerge in NATO statements and in strategic documents. And Russia, lest we forget, has been a Pacific power for centuries. And if you work here at the lab, you can drive up to Fort Ross State Historical Park, 125 miles north of San Francisco, and actually visit the most southerly outpost of the old Russian Empire in North America. And we, I think, in the United States often forget that Russia is a Pacific power. It has not been much of a Pacific player since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So when Putin goes to Vladivostok in the Far East and gives a big speech about Russia's Pacific power, or he meets Xi Jinping in Vladivostok and talks about being a Pacific power, it makes a lot of heads turn. People take notice, say, boy, what a change in Russian foreign policy. And a lot of analysis is being done on sort of why is Russia pivoting to Asia? Will this pivot succeed? And I think what Chris did wonderfully in his recent book, We Shall Be Masters, Russian Pivots to East Asia from Peter the Great to Putin, which I just finished, was put Russia's role in the Pacific into historical context. He does a great job of showing sort of the waxings and wanings of Russian interest in the Pacific, which turn out to be pretty cyclical, depending on rulers or what's taking place in Europe or elsewhere in the Russian state, and the limitations that Russia faces in being a Pacific power, which have remained, I think, pretty constant over time. So it was really interesting to read this book and see over hundreds of years the same patterns of sort of Russian interest, Russian overreach, Russian pullbacks, and then a renewal of interest as I read through it. So Chris is going to go through all this in detail in his presentation. I thought it was a fascinating topic. Let me just say a little bit about Chris. He's an assistant professor of international history at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and co-director of the school's Russia and Eurasia Program. He's the author of a couple of prior books to this one, Putinomics, The Power and Money in Resurgent Russia, which came out in 2018, and The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy in 2016. He's previously served as the associate director of the Brady-Johnson Program in Grand Strategy at Yale. He's been a lecturer at the New Economic School in Moscow. He's been a visiting researcher at Carnegie Moscow Center, which is a great source of information on Russian politics. He was a research associate at the Brookings Institute, and he was a fellow at the German Marshall Fund's Transatlantic Academy. He received his Ph.D. and MA from Yale and his BA in history from Harvard University. So the ground rules, as always, Chris is going to deliver his remarks for about 30 to 45 minutes, at which point we'll open the floor up for discussion. Please raise your hand electronically. Please submit your questions in the chat function as Chris is talking or shortly after he concludes his remarks, so we can get the discussion rolling quickly once he finishes his remarks and try to get as many of your questions and comments in as possible in the time allotted. So Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Over to you, and very much looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I will pull up my slides right now. It was actually a perfect introduction in many ways. I'd like to start with some of the culinary aspects of the relationship today that you just mentioned. This is a photo here of President Xi and Vladimir Putin at the birthday party that Angela Stent writes about, where Xi gifted Putin what is supposedly Putin's favorite type of ice cream. And at this birthday party, Xi described Putin as his, quote, best friend. And so this, I think, is a wonderful image to start this conversation with. As Mike mentioned, I've just published a book based on a fair number of years of research on the history of Russian diplomacy in Asia, which was intended to try to historicize this moment and make sense of it over the past couple of centuries of Russian history. Because, of course, although we hear a lot about Xi and Putin's bromance today, and I think bromance has got to be the word we use to describe it, given the number of trips they take together and meals they cook together. When Vladimir Putin says the relationship has reached a, quote, unprecedented level, this, to me as a historian, raised a question, which is this true? The answer, certainly not. But then another question came, which is, well, how do we understand this seemingly cyclical pattern in Russian foreign policy, where at certain times Russia is deeply engaged in Asia, and not only in relations with China, but also at various points with Japan, with Korea, with the broader Pacific Ocean. And then at other times, it's almost completely ignoring what's going on in East Asia, devoting very little effort to project power in the region, very little focus on shaping politics in the region. And this is not simply a 20th century phenomenon going back to the Cold War, although certainly we did, of course, see periods of both intense support for different governments in Asia by the Soviet Union, coupled with very deep falling outs. In fact, this is a trend that dates back until at least Peter the Great. And you could arguably bring it back further in time, but I figured 300 years of history was enough to cover in one book, and gave us enough case studies, if you will, for the social scientists in the audience for understanding, well, why is it that Russia at times turns its attention to the East and at times turns its attention to the West. When we normally think about Russian foreign policy, and when Russians normally think about Russian foreign policy, most of the focus is on the Western front, That's where Russia's biggest wars have been fought over the past couple of centuries. That's where Russian diplomacy devotes most of its efforts today and has for most of the past couple of centuries. But it's not solely focused on the West, on the Central and Eastern European plains, on relations with Germany and France and the United States. There's also a long history of relations with China, with Japan, with Korea, with the countries of Central Asia that border China, the regions bordering today's Xinjiang province in China, and also with the broader Pacific Ocean. And so as I began reading more deeply in the history of Russian foreign policy in Asia, this cyclical nature stood out to me as a really surprising and important fact. We often speak of nations having enduring interests, and especially in the historiography of Russian foreign policy, there's a strong school of thought that sees Russia as having enduring interests. But what's, I think, striking to me is the extent to which Russian interest in Asia has not endured in a sort of constant sense. It's fluctuated wildly. There's been spasms of interest, followed by spasms of disinterest that don't seem necessarily correlated with Russian power in aggregate or with the scope for advances in Asia. So it seemed to me that there was something else driving Russia's interest in Asia, domestic politics, and also domestic ideological shifts as well that were making Russians excited at certain times about affairs in Asia and disinterested at other times. And what really struck me is the extent to which the language that Russian leaders and Russian officials used to describe Asia often had this sort of utopian character. Asia was a place where Russia could turn for redemption, where it could establish itself as a great power, where it could set up a alternative geopolitical sphere against the West. And all of this language struck me, whether you're looking at the period of the czars through the Soviet period up to the present, as extraordinarily grandiose. The type of language you wouldn't use if you were simply calculating rationally, but that is instead driven by deeper ambitions and concerns in Russian political culture. So what I'd like to do in this talk is start with the history and argue that Russia's relations with Asia today can be understood to a certain extent through historical patterns. Not to say that there's any sort of straightforward lesson we can draw from history and apply it to predict the future, but it is to say that there are some reoccurring patterns in the history of Russian foreign policy and in the history of how Russians think, the Russian elite thinks about its map of the world, that I think do shed some light on understanding how Russia views Asia in the broader context of its domestic and foreign policies. Today, as Mike mentioned, I published a book earlier this year called We Shall Be Masters, which is a quote from a somewhat famous passage of Dostoevsky, which was written in the late 1800s after a time when Russian forces conquered one of the tribes that was opposing them in Central Asia, and it was a great massacre of the local forces by Russian armies, and it was celebrated by the Russian nationalist media at the time, which in the latter decades of the 1800s was growing in its importance. And Dostoevsky, who was at the time a very ardent nationalist, celebrated this victory as well by saying, "In Europe we were hangers-on and slaves. Well, in Asia we shall be masters. In Europe we were Tatars. Well, in Asia we are the Europeans." And I think this quote to me was really quite striking, both because of the assertion of dominance over Russia's Asian neighbors, but also the assumed subordinate of Russia to Europeans. Even in Asia, Russians are sort of envisioning themselves as playing the role of Europeans, at least in Dostoevsky's day, which I thought was an interesting place to start an imperial project from. Now you can date the Russian interest in the Pacific Ocean until at least as early as Peter the Great, as I mentioned. Russian fur trappers first rounded the corner around the Eurasian subcontinent into the Bering Straits several centuries ago, and were exploring the Kamchatkan coast even before the days of Peter the Great, trapping furs, trying to map the territory along the Kamchatkan seashores. But the first real Russian effort to establish a sphere of geopolitical influence or even an empire in the Pacific Ocean doesn't date till the early 1800s. The period when Alexander I was Russia's Tsar, when Europe was engulfed by the different phases of the Napoleonic Wars. And I'll start with this somewhat grainy picture. It's the best picture I've got, unfortunately, of the most unexpected Russian fort of any Russian forts in the world. The Russian Empire, of course, conquered many territories at various points in its history, but most of us don't think of the Russian Empire of having conquered Kauai, the island in the Hawaiian archipelago. But this is a image of Fort Elizaveta on the island of Kauai. At one point, there were 3 different forts around 1815 on the island of Kauai, which at the time was governed by its own king, constantly at war with King Kamehameha, who was the king of the rest of the Hawaiian Islands. And for a time in 1815, the king of Kauai briefly became a subject of the Russian Tsar. He was only a subject for long enough to send a letter back to St. Petersburg. And when the Tsar and Foreign Minister Nesselrode discovered that one of their agents in the far-off Pacific had made the Hawaiian king a subject of the Russian Empire, they immediately revoked his citizenship. But for a moment, there was a number of Russians living on Hawaii and a couple of naval ships that were deployed to the region, which is a really, I think, striking place to start a history of Russian imperialism and the Russian Empire building in the Pacific Ocean, because it's just so surprising that the Russians were there. But in fact, it's in some ways not a surprise, or at least there's a logic to why the Russians ended up in Hawaii in the early 1800s, and it illustrates both the grandiosity of Russian dreams at the time, but also the fundamental problem that all Russian efforts at power projection in the Pacific Ocean have faced, which is the problem of logistics and the problem of supply lines. Russians' first efforts to cross the Pacific came to Alaska. The Russians hopped up the Aleutian Island chain, which is not far at all from Kamchatka, in the latter years of the 1700s and the early years of the 1800s, established a couple of major cities, or major settlements, I guess you would say. They were really small in terms of population. In the early 1800s, here's the Russian settlement at what's today called Sitka in Alaska, which is one of the largest Russian settlements in the region. And the Russians were very excited in many ways about this settlement. It offered the prospect of harvesting furs from the or at the time, waters rich in otters and seals that could then be sent to Guangzhou in China, which is one of the entrepôts of the global fur trade. But of course, to get from Russia to Alaska was itself quite difficult, and to get supplies from Russia to Alaska was even more difficult, because if you wanted to sail from Russia to Alaska at the time, you could do so through the very treacherous waters of the North Pacific. But there were no real ports on the Pacific coast. The best port at the time was the port of Okhotsk, which is a very bad port. Vladivostok had not yet been founded. There were, as of yet, no substantial Russian settlements on Kamchatka. There was a small one, but nothing large. And so it was extraordinarily difficult to get supplies to Alaska. Even though Alaska was close geographically to what were then the borders of the Russian Empire, it was on the opposite side of the world, almost literally from St. Petersburg. And indeed, if you wanted to ship supplies from St. Petersburg or from Moscow or from the cities of central Russia to Alaska, you either had to send them by foot or by carriage across Siberia, which is something you'd only do in certain seasons because the roads became very muddy in spring and fall. It was an almost year-long journey from St. Petersburg to the Pacific coast, and then longer to cross the Pacific. Or you could send them, which is no less inefficient, around the world on a ship, leaving from the great port of Kronstadt through the Baltic Sea, south of the Atlantic Ocean, around the southern tip of South America, and up through the South and the North Pacific, all the way to Alaska. These were Russian supply lines in the early 1800s, and so you can see why they were looking for a better place to acquire food than shipping it from literally halfway across the world, which is what attracted the Russians not only to Fort Ross, which Mike mentioned, not far from where I think many of you are currently based. If you haven't visited before, I strongly recommend it. It's been redone recently, funded by a Russian oligarch, in fact, who's foot the bill for a reconstruction of Fort Ross. But the settlements in Hawaii have not yet been reconstructed. Only one of them is really still remaining today. But Russians settle in Hawaii with the aim of trying to open up supply chains, open up a source of food for the Alaska colonies, because the Russians in Alaska did all right during the summers, but in the winter, when fresh foods and vegetables became scarce, the number of Russians who were sickened by scurvy in the average winter of the early 1800s was extraordinarily high, simply because it was impossible to get any fresh food. The treatment for scurvy at the time was to take tree bark, brew it into a sort of beer, and drink that, which I don't think has any medicinal properties, but perhaps it made the winter easier to live through. And so this was the first Russian effort to build an empire in the Pacific. In hindsight, it seems absurd to think that you could knit together, with a shipyard in St. Petersburg, you could knit together a maritime empire that connected Hawaii, a couple of Alaskan ports, and California. And yet, for a time, this was the centerpiece of Russia's foreign policy in the Pacific throughout much of the time when Alexander I was the Tsar, until it just became too expensive, unreasonably expensive, and until Russia was pushed out by the Americans and the British, both of whom from their North American colonies had far clearer and easier supply chains to deal with when they were supplying their own colonies on the Pacific. And so this map of the North Pacific in the early 1800s, where on the one hand you can sort of see the logic between connecting Okhotsk, Alaskan settlements like Kodiak and Hawaii. On the other hand, the distances are so vast, and the major places of Russian settlement like St. Petersburg and Moscow so far away they don't fit on a map. Illustrates, I think, the dilemmas that Russians faced when they were trying to build empires in the Pacific, which is why the Russians had a first mover advantage in some ways in terms of Pacific settlement. They settled in California before there was any real prospect of California becoming American. At the time, it was a Spanish and a Mexican colony, or Spanish and Mexican territory, rather than a American territory. But simply because of the supply differentials, the ease of access, it became impossible for Russia to sustain these territories. And after just a couple of years, the Kauaian king was found that his Russian citizenship was revoked, and Russia began to withdraw its presence, both military and commercial, from the Pacific. Now, it might seem like it's possible to write off this case as sort of just an eccentric piece of history. It's of course fun to connect Russia and Hawaii in any sort of way you can. There aren't many ways to connect them. Fun too to see the remnants of this in California, just north of San Francisco on the Pacific coast. But what I'd like to suggest is that the sense of excessive enthusiasm that drove the Russians to, or at least some Russians, to be convinced that Hawaii was a place where Russia could durably wield influence over time is not unique to that period. In fact, it's something that repeats itself throughout the history of Russian engagement in East Asia. And you see this not only with the colonies that failed, the places where Russia established a presence and then eventually withdrew or sold its holdings, but also with the colonies that succeeded. One of the, I think, most interesting case studies of this is in the 1850s, at a time when the Russia-China border in what's now the Russian Far East was not yet delineated. And most people believed, including most Russian leaders, though they didn't admit it very publicly, that most of the Pacific coast belonged to the Chinese, or to the Qing Empire at the time, though neither Russia nor China had much of a presence at all along the Pacific coast, simply because it was so far from the geographies that both countries were focused on. But there were a number of Russian officials that had a very good access to the Tsar himself. This was the days of Tsar Nicholas II, like the gentleman pictured here, Nicholas Muravyov, who later took the surname Amursky after conquering the lands of the Amur River, which flows from the highlands to the east of Lake Baikal into the Pacific Ocean, who believed that by conquering the Amur River Valley, Russia could open itself a new future. And people like Muravyov-Amursky were very interesting characters. Muravyov-Amursky came from a very aristocratic family, but like a not insignificant number of aristocrats, also had sort of utopian visions for how Russian politics could be reformed. He was opposed to the stodgy, bureaucratic nature of the Russia that had lost the Crimean War, and was looking for a new outlet for Russian greatness, and saw in the Amur River Valley territory that could revitalize Russia, he believed. He and many other authors wrote of the Amur Valley as a Russian Mississippi, referencing the steamships that were then plodding up and down America's Mississippi River, connecting the west and east of the United States and the north and south with global trade. Even one of his advisors argued the Amur River could be a holy land for Russia, in which Russia could find itself revitalized spiritually, not simply geopolitically or commercially by conquering it. And these are sort of grandiose claims that are so utopian or metaphysical, it's sort of hard to make sense of them. But we know very clearly that they influenced Russian policy, because we can trace the usage of language like this all the way to the Tsar himself. Amursky played a major role in in convincing the Tsar to send the first Russian naval mission to the Pacific coast, where the Russian captain at the time raised a Russian flag, despite having come across a number of Chinese government agents along his journey. He sent back a note to Tsar Nikolai, who somewhat famously declared, "Where the Russian flag has been raised, it shall not be taken down." And this sense of optimism about conquest not only motivated policy entrepreneurs, if you will, like Muraviev-Amursky, but also the Tsar himself. And so over the course of the 1850s into 1860, Russia conquered a vast swath of the Pacific Ocean coast, much of the Russian Far East region today, especially the regions just to the north of the Chinese border, were conquered in this fit of enthusiasm about what the Amur could bring to Russia. And in some ways, this succeeded. These territories are still Russian to this day, despite the collapse of the Tsarist Empire and then despite the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think it's equally plausible to see this as a sort of a failure in its geopolitical and its economic and certainly in its spiritual terms. What's striking is after 1860, the Russian government, having conquered the region, promptly forgot about it. The only Russians who settled there were either army units or prisoners who were sent to penal colonies in the area or further on to Sakhalin Island. It was basically unpopulated by Russian citizens until the end of the 19th century. It played no sort of commercial role whatsoever. It did not become a Russian Mississippi, and although it's hard to assess whether it became a holy land, I think it's difficult to argue that it had any sort of broader role in spiritually revitalizing the Russian people either. So it was in some ways a success, in other ways an extraordinary failure, especially relative to the expectations that were set. And I think what's really striking is the extent to which even the individuals that were driving this sense of optimism about what Russia could find on its Pacific coast immediately after having conquered the territory promptly forgot about it. Muraviev-Amursky himself retired to Paris, where he would eventually die. He kept tabs for a while on news from the Amur and Ussuri river valleys, but remarked to a friend in his final years who asked whether he would ever return to the region that he conquered, that he would never want to live any more years in a wasteland such as that. And indeed, the territory lived on as a wasteland for some time, and even up to the present is only really kept economically viable by subsidies from Moscow. So in some ways, this is an extraordinary failure of the Russian state building project, having grabbed a vast chunk of territory and then failed to find a way to use it and make it productive in any sense for decades, if not for over a century. Now, one of the key problems that Russia faced in the days of its Trans-Pacific Empire, its Hawaiian ambitions, and in the days of its conquest of the Amur and Ussuri river valleys on the Pacific coast north of China was infrastructure. The fact that it was just extraordinarily difficult to ship goods or soldiers from the center of Russia, where the populace lived, where the economy was centered, to the frontier. And Russia's always had optimism about infrastructure projects that will connect the Far East with the rest of Russia. This optimism dates back to the latter decades of the 1800s, when the first discussions were made about building a Trans-Siberian Railroad, and such a railroad was eventually built. But what I think is striking and important is the extent to which, even when these infrastructure projects materialize, one infrastructure project alone is never enough to credibly connect the Russian Far East with the rest of Russia. And no number of infrastructure projects can improve connectivity enough to make these regions better connected with Moscow, say, than they'd be connected with Beijing or Tokyo. The Trans-Pacific Rail, the Trans-Siberian Railroad that Russia built was in some ways a success of engineering. Although it wasn't the first transcontinental railroad, it was completed only decades after both the American and the Canadian Trans-Pacific Railroads. It was harder to engineer. It took longer to build and traversed more territory in terms of the numbers of miles that were produced. But I think what's most interesting about it is that although it, to a certain extent, addressed the problem of transportation, it embroiled Russia in greater problems that put even more stress on the problem of transportation and ultimately didn't solve the dilemmas that Russia was looking to solve. There is a direct connection between the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railroad and the Russian march towards war with Japan in 1904 and 1905. Japanese leaders, as early as the Trans-Siberian Railroad first began to be constructed, believed that this project might drive the two countries towards war. And when it did do that, the railroad itself proved enough to embroil Russia in a vast conflict, but not enough to actually enable Russia to ship sufficient numbers of troops to the Far East. And so, although there's many reasons why Russia lost the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, an important part of the reason is that there was a constant deficit of men and materiel on the fronts in China. The war was actually mostly fought in China simply because even though the Japanese had to ship their army across bodies of water, it was easier to do that than shipping Russian forces across Siberia on what was then a single tracked railroad. So if a train was going east, the train was going west, would have to pull off to the side while the other train was going to pass it. So this was far from a silver bullet when it came to the question of resolving Russia's infrastructure difficulties. There was a member of the Russian general staff in the 1880s who referred to Russia as being like a great comet with a core, dense core in Europe and a vulnerable tail that stretched all the way across the Eurasian landmass. And that dynamic was true in the 1880s. It was true in the early decades of the 1900s. It was true during World War II. It is true today. And I think that dynamic is something that has been deeply ingrained in Russia's strategic culture, understanding the difficulties of infrastructure and the difficulties of transportation from west to east. Now, it wasn't simply physical infrastructure and bridges and roads and railways that were mobilized to try to bind different political forces in Asia to the Russian Empire. There were also ideological bridges that were created at different points in time. During the Tsarist period, there was a real effort by a number of Tsarist officials to cast Imperial Russia as an Asian empire in certain ways. And before he became Tsar, still Crown Prince, Tsar Nicholas II took a grand tour, as did many of the European royals at the time, but his grand tour went not to the great capitals of Western Europe, but to the great capitals of Asia. He traveled through India, went tiger hunting, visited temples, all the way through Southeast Asia, China, and then Japan, where in Japan he was actually stabbed by a policeman and almost killed, which some people argue explains some of his animosity towards the Japanese that would eventually lead to the Russo-Japanese War. But it wasn't only in the Tsarist period where there were efforts to cast Russia as an Asian power. The Bolsheviks did the same thing, arguing that they were a Mecca for the East, as it was put fairly frequently in the 1920s. After the hope for revolution in Western Europe sputtered out, a number of key Communist Party leaders tried to play up the use of Bolshevism in decolonizing movements and position the Soviet Union as a leader in Asian decolonization. And it's often, I think, easy to forget just how substantial a role the Bolshevik Party played before this point. Certainly, we're all familiar with the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, but even before the Chinese Communist Party began playing a major role in Chinese politics, the Soviet Union played a fundamentally important role in setting up the Kuomintang as well. Chiang Kai-shek's son, of course, famously lived in Moscow for a very long time and spoke fluent Russian. And the Kuomintang itself was partially founded by a communist revolutionary turned Chicago school teacher after the 1904-1905 revolution named Mikhail Borodin, who was really the organization guy behind the foundation of the Chinese Nationalist Party, in charge of details as minute as their furniture budget, which was detailed in memos to Moscow on a regular basis. And there was a sense that in Moscow that there were ideological resources that could be provided, as well as more traditional resources like funds and weaponry to nationalist movements across East Asia, not only the Kuomintang, but they were the most important case study. And here too, there was both great optimism followed by great disappointment. Stalin personally devoted immense resources in terms of domestic political capital and also foreign policy attention to building up the Chinese nationalists in the mid 1920s, from 1923 to 24 all the way through 1927, and even after Chiang Kai-shek had shown his true colors by massacring communists in Shanghai in the middle of the 1920s, there was still a number of high-profile events in Moscow where Stalin arranged to have Marx, Lenin, Engels, and Chiang Kai-shek held up as four prophets of the revolution that was then sweeping the world, not only the European world, but also the Asian world as well. And of course, this turned out very badly for for the Soviet Union. The Chinese Communist Party was marginalized over the course of the 1920s. Chiang Kai-shek ousted the Soviets from their position of influence after having used them to build up his own army. And the Soviets lost interest almost entirely in China from the late 1920s all the way through the beginning of World War II. So immense optimism replaced by a period of disinterest because the goods that the Soviet Union was offering were poorly crafted. They were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Chinese politics, a belief that somehow Chiang Kai-shek was in fact a Marxist or a revolutionary, and proved to be in the end contrary to Russia's interest rather than promoting it. But again, what's striking here is the extraordinary optimism, the amount that Stalin put into his relationship with Chiang Kai-shek in the 1920s, the naive belief that this could be a relationship that would pay off in the long run, despite some of the more sober analysts on Stalin's staff having a much more cautious attitude for what this would mean in the long run. So this is the history of Russian relations in Asia today. The next question I'd like to ask is, well, what does it mean for understanding the Russia-China relationship at the present? And obviously, as I mentioned at the outset, there's no, I think, direct lessons that we can draw. There's no guaranteed fluctuations that we can trace. But nevertheless, I think there are things we can say about China-Russia economic ties, the security relationship, the technology and military relationship today that can be elucidated by this knowledge of both intense interest in the past and intense disinterest, fluctuating back and forth over time as different leaders took power and left power in Russia, and as different grand ventures to make Russia a great power in Asia were established and then fizzled out. So what I'll do in the next couple of slides is set out a couple of basic facts about the Russia-China relationship in economic, political, security terms, and then conclude with some thoughts on what the history does tell us. What we can say on the economic front is that there's been undoubtedly a really substantial increase in the economic relationship between Russia and China over the past 15 years, in particular from a very low base. And of course, every country has experienced growing trade with China simply because China's economy has grown so drastically, but Russia's no exception to this trend. Russia-China trade is correlated with oil prices because much of what Russia sells to China is either oil or natural gas, and because Russia's ability to buy things from China is also correlated with oil prices. But the increase in trade has been really quite substantial, and it's economically meaningful and probably also to a certain extent politically meaningful too. What's also striking is the extent to which Russia's trade with China makes up a much larger share of Russia's aggregate trade than China's trade with Russia. If Russia were to stop trading with China in an aggregate sense, China would barely notice, although it would certainly notice in terms of gas supplies. Whereas for Russia, China is a really important trading partner. Not the biggest trading partner. The EU is far more important as a bloc, but certainly an important trading partner for Russia. If you look at the specific energy commodities that Russia supplies to China, Russia is a large supplier of oil to China, although the oil market is quite liquid. So if one supplier cuts you off, it's relatively easy to get supplies from another supplier. The gas market's a bit different, although Russian gas is small. The latest data that the Russians released in 2018 doesn't yet take into account a new pipeline that's come online. So as we get new data released, we'll have an increase in Russian gas supplies over time. And the Power of Siberia pipeline, which is the pipeline that I mentioned, is, I think, an important turning point in Russia-China relations because it will bind Russia to selling gas to China via this pipeline. Once you build a pipeline, you've got no choice as to where you eventually sell the gas through. And so this will, I think, pretty clearly make Russia more dependent on China, though not necessarily make China more dependent on Russia, since China is able to buy gas from a bunch of different countries. But although the trade relationship has grown, the investment relationship hasn't grown, which is, I think, quite interesting. If you look at the major investors in Russia, what you find is that there's not a lot of Chinese investment in Russia. Investment data is kind of tricky to work with because so much of investment is routed through tax havens. But the best efforts that kind of back out the effect of tax havens suggest that only a small fraction of Russia's FDI stock comes from China, and that countries like Japan are basically as important as investors in Russia as China are. So there's no kind of clear meaningful growth in the investment flows from China to Russia or in the opposite direction. But what we have seen is some pretty substantial increases in Chinese strategic investment in companies like Novatek, the large gas company, working with Sinopec and Gazprombank to fund new gas projects. And this is something that I think is quite meaningful. So on the economic front, aggregate trade has increased, and there's been in strategic sectors an increase in economic relations, even if there's also some spheres like investment where there's not nearly as much cooperation as the rhetoric might suggest. What about the security realm? Well, here too the picture is, I think, quite mixed. On the one hand, there's extraordinarily close security cooperation between Russia and China, the closest it's been in a very long time, arguably forever. And this is undeniable. We see it in terms of meetings between Chinese and Russian officials, pictured here. We see it in terms of defense sales of Russian military equipment to China, which have increased in terms of the level of technology that Russia's been willing to sell China, much more substantive than we saw a decade or two ago. Vladimir Putin recently announced a number of I think interesting projects. One about helping China build a early warning system for missiles, which is of course a system that could have potential strategic ramifications for Russia and for China. And this is something that shows a fair amount of strategic trust between the two countries, at least in this particular sphere. And in spheres like jet engines, at least until very recently, Russia's retained a substantial lead over China, and so has been an important supplier of these goods to China. There's been exercises together in the South China Sea and the Baltic Sea and the Pacific in ways that have been very clearly designed to signal improving military ties. And here's a similar exercise in the Baltic Sea as well. In the technology sector, there's also been, I think, interesting closing of relations, and especially in the technology sector as it's relevant to security. One of the biggest and most successful Russian facial recognition companies was recently bought by a Chinese firm, so there's some cross-border investment happening there. Huawei has been very, very public about building up its position in Russia, funding programs at a variety of Russian universities in Russia. Has a couple of centers that it refers to as R&D centers across Russia. I've looked into this and I haven't been able to figure out what actually these centers do, but it's got institutions that it calls R&D centers in Russia. So again, an effort to expand China's tech footprint in Russia. And yet, when you look at how the two countries describe their geopolitical visions, you don't always see them lining up. China's Belt and Road is not a vision that has been very appealing to Moscow. Moscow's been very careful not to reject it in any way, but it's also been very careful not to really endorse it. And instead, Russia's endorsed a somewhat contradictory set of visions that are not Beijing focused, but rather are Moscow focused. Now, the Eurasian Economic Union being one example of this, not a very successful example, I think, by most metrics. And more interesting over the past year and a half, maybe it's two and a half years, has been the concept of a greater Eurasian partnership, which Russia believes could bring together not only Russia and China, but also India and Iran, which of course, from the Russian perspective, have the benefit of balancing out China's influence in that type of relationship. Now, Russia and China, of course, see a very key shared goal of standing up to the U.S., but they do also have some interests that don't completely overlap. And the question, I think, for us looking forward is, to what extent will this one overriding goal remain the overriding goal of standing up to the U.S. versus is there a chance in the future that the points of potential friction actually begin to grind against each other? Right now, there's no sign of that happening. We've seen everything from military affairs to financial systems being shaped by the antagonism with the United States that both countries have. You see this in their exports. You see this in the Russian central bank's decision to hold some of its foreign currency reserves in renminbi, a sort of meaningless step, but nevertheless a symbolic one. But there's also a deep well of concern in Russia about China's ultimate aims. I occasionally spend some time trolling the darker corners of the Russian nationalist internet, which I don't recommend for anyone in terms of mental health. But nevertheless, you do find interesting maps like this one, which I thought was quite striking. And this is one Russian's vision of how foreign powers want to divide up Russia. You might not have been aware that Canada has designs on Chukotka, but in fact, the Canadians are seen to be just as devious as the rest of us. But of course, in any any Russian's deepest fear of the country being divided by foreign powers, China takes a big chunk. And although I think it's not at all realistic to think that China's going to take a chunk of Russian territory, what's important is that this is still part of Russian political discourse in a relatively serious way. You don't have to dig very deeply to find Russians talking about concern that China has designs on Russian territory. And although the border has been settled in terms of delineated, I think the historical issues have not been fully settled. And questions like who founded Vladivostok and did Russia steal Vladivostok from China are still really live historical questions, even if they're not, even if they're kept out of high politics by very deliberate actions in both leaders in Moscow and in Beijing. If you look at other geopolitical visions, you don't always see them lining up either. China, for example, talks about the Polar Silk Road, which is, of course, something that would transit through Russian waters. Russia, of course, has been substantially expanding the militarization of the Arctic, establishing new military facilities, which is largely aimed at the United States and NATO, but probably not solely. And if there's indeed more traffic through the Northern Sea route, that would have ramifications for Russia-China relations as well. And the most interesting territory, I think, is Central Asia today, where you really see in the most concrete sense, literally concrete sense in terms of roads and bridges being built, China's growing influence. And you used to hear as recently as 5 years ago in Moscow, well, China does the economics and Russia does the security, and that's the division of labor. But what's really striking is the extent to which that's no longer true. When you look at arms sales to Central Asia, China is catching up in terms of aggregate value. There's a great paper by Lemon and Jardine that track arms transfers. The think tank that I work with, called the Foreign Policy Research Institute, is about to publish a paper tracking Chinese bilateral and multilateral security engagements, so exercises and meetings between defense officials between China and the 5 Central Asian countries. And what's really striking is just the depth of connections across all levels of the security services, across the prosecutorial services, the Interior Ministry, the Army. No individual connection or training exercise is particularly important when you look at just the sheer volume of Chinese security contacts with Central Asia. It really is quite striking. And for a couple of the countries in Central Asia, according to Lemon and Jardine, China sold more arms than Russia over the past couple of years, which I think is a striking fact. And when you start looking at military exercises as well, you see a really substantial increase in China's presence over the past couple of years. So it's no longer true that Russia does security and China does economics in Central Asia. Thus far, that hasn't created any tension, but it's not difficult to imagine how it might. Now, of course, there are people in Russia who argue that their geography, both sitting across the Eurasian landmass, bordering Europe and bordering Asia, gives them substantial advantages. If you look at routes of train tracks transiting from China to Europe, they almost inevitably have to cross through Russia at some point, or else they have to take maritime routes across the Caspian Sea. The same thing is true of internet cables, largely crossing over Russian territory if they transit by land from China to Europe. But geography is also a source of vulnerabilities, as the Russian General Staff realized very long ago. The notion of Russia as a comet at the European core with a long, vulnerable tail stretching across the Eurasian landmass is something that remains very true to this day. The infrastructural connections are really no better in comparative terms than they were in the late 19th century. Although the Trans-Siberian Railroad has been completed, anyone who's driven in parts of Siberia, the Russian Far East, will be familiar with highways that turn to gravel routes with very little warning. So there's certainly still a challenge there of Russia's infrastructure in the region. And that creates concerns in Russian political culture that are probably unjustified. From the perspective today, certainly unjustified, but nevertheless very live in Russian politics. And one of the most common of these memes, if you will, in Russian politics is that there's going to be a vast flow of Chinese migrants settling in the Far East and outpopulating the Russians. And anyone who's looked at salary rates in northern China versus the Russian Far East will find that you're better off staying in northern China if you're just simply maximizing your financial self-interest, and you're interested in the weather being better too. Although it's quite cold in northern China, it's even colder parts of Siberia. So there's really no reason for large numbers of Chinese to be settling the Russian Far East, and there's no evidence that this is happening on any sort of substantive scale. But what's striking is the extent to which this is constantly brought up in Russian discussion of Russia-China relations, not by the government today. It's been really suppressed from official conversation, but at a popular level, concerns like these remain very live, especially in the Far East regions. And so if you follow local media sources and places like Irkutsk or Khabarovsk, you find much more discussion of China and in a much more wary tone than you get if you follow discussions in the major news sources in Moscow, which I think which is an interesting place to stop and ask the question, well, what are the risks to Russia-China entente? There's no doubt, as I said at the outset, that we've seen relations at the closest level they've arguably ever been. There's no doubt that Xi and Putin themselves have a personal bromance with each other that's been a key driver of this relationship. But there also, I think, is no doubt that there's over-optimism on the Russian side about what this relationship can deliver. And that, I think, imbalance does create some risks in the future. Maybe not next year, maybe in 20 years. I'm not sure when. I'm a historian, so it's not my job to predict the future. But it does seem like we'd be wrong not to think that there are these risks going forward. One obvious risk is that something goes wrong in Russia-China cooperation in Central Asia. I think it's it's increasingly hard to buy into the official Russian line that there's just going to be inevitable Russia-China cooperation in the region. When I was last able to put this question to people I trusted in Moscow, which was now in pre-pandemic in 2019, the argument that I got was that, well, Russia is going to succeed in binding the Chinese into a set of patterns of behavior via institutions in Central Asia, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other institutions. And this struck me as a really interesting argument, both because Russia, of course, is not a country that has generally placed its faith in the ability of institutions to bind great powers' behavior, and the claim that Russia's going to be able to bind China in institutions also strikes me as diluted. But that, nevertheless, I think is sort of the official position in Moscow right now, and I wonder how long that will remain viable, especially as China's security presence increases. Second risk is, of course, local politics in Russia, which remains the great repository of anti-Chinese sentiment. Although President Putin and the Kremlin have kept, I think, very vigilantly a lid on any sort of anti-Chinese discussion in mass media today, when you look at local politics across Siberia and the Russian Far East in particular, but really across all of Russia, you see plenty of political resources that could be mobilized around an anti-Chinese line. It's very common, for example, to have environmental protests in the Russian Far East and in Siberia take an anti-Chinese line. This is a protest around environmentalism, environmental issues around Baikal, the Great Lake in Siberia, which a Chinese-owned factory was supposed to be polluting. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I think what's striking is the extent to which this environmental protest was very quickly wrapped up in anti-China rhetoric and took on greater salience as a result of that. And I think especially if you imagine that Vladimir Putin will ever leave the scene of Russian politics, I don't bet on it happening soon, but I don't think he's going to be immortal either. It seems like a natural place to turn if you're looking to whip up some nationalist sentiment is to bang on about the Chinese threat to Siberia and the Far East, since that is a message that certainly in those regions does have, I think, a striking amount of salience. It's kept below the surface today, but it's still certainly very present. And the third risk, of course, is to the leaders themselves, neither of whom will be in power forever, although they're both young by American terms as leaders go, and seem to be both in good health. They both personally invested in the relationship. Putin has been very clearly leading, I think, the Russian effort to make sure that everyone in Russia gets the message that friendship with China is the order of the day. And I think on the Chinese side, one of the very few striking successes of Chinese diplomacy over the past decade, and there have been really, China's angered basically every country along its border, most countries around the world. They're even in a spat right now with Lithuania, which is so far away it's hard to get in a spat with, but nevertheless, China's very deftly managed, I think, the relationship with Russia, where Russia is very clearly not the big brother anymore, but is not made to feel like the little brother, which I think takes some skill and some subtlety, which is not normally what Chinese diplomacy is known for, but which I suspect the leadership itself has played a role in in crafting. So I see that as a third risk to Russia-China entente that is worth following in the future. All this is to say that, of course, the current period of entente could last for some time. If you look historically at the duration of Russia's pivots to Asia, its spasms of enthusiasm about what it can get out of politics in Asia, sometimes they last for a couple of years, sometimes for a decade, sometimes for slightly longer. So there's, I think, no rote or mechanistic timing I can give you. But what I can say, having studied the history, is that there's certainly a trend, a pattern, if you will, of over-optimism and excessive enthusiasm, that when the bubble bursts and opinions in Moscow shift, they often shift quite sharply. And so I don't predict that will happen tomorrow or anytime soon, but I think we ought to be cognizant of this lesson of history, which is that when these turns do happen, they can often surprise people in Moscow as well as people looking on from the outside. So I'll stop there, but would welcome any comments or questions that you have.
Wonderful, thanks, Chris. That was fantastic. Already have some questions in the chat, and I will start bundling those up and asking them now. So a couple